in a folder labeled Western District of North Carolina, criminal case 14,287, filed October of 1956, there is a single page of trial testimony. A federal prosecutor admits on the record that the man on the stand had been distilling for 41 years, had never once been caught in the act 41 years. Not arrested at the still, not photographed at the still, not identified by a single witness who saw the still operating. The government had the jars, they had the corn, they had the copper. What they did not have, and what they could never seem to obtain, was the moment of the crime itself. How does a man distill for 4 decades in mountains, crawling with revenue agents, informants, and aerial surveillance, and never once get seen at the work? The answer is not luck. The answer is a body of knowledge so refined, so deliberately taught from father to son and mother to daughter across the southern Appalachians, that by the middle of the 20th century it had become something closer to a discipline than a trade. And most of that discipline is now illegal to practice, illegal to teach, and in 47 states, illegal even to assemble the equipment for. The Foxfire interviews collected in Rabun County, Georgia, between 1,966 and 1,979, the oral histories preserved at the Archives of Appalachia at East Tennessee State University. The trial transcripts from the Great Moonshine Conspiracy of 1,935 inches, Franklin County, Virginia, all describe the same 20 skills again and again in different voices across different decades. This is the documented record of how they did it. To understand the skills, you have to understand the world that produced them. In 1900, the average cash income of a family in the Blue Ridge counties of North Carolina was less than $90 a year. Corn could be hauled to market as grain and sold for roughly 50 cents a bushel. It could be condensed by fire and copper and patience into something that fetched $4 a gallon. A mule could carry 6 bushels of corn. That same mule could carry the liquid product of 30 bushels. The mountains did not choose moonshine because the mountains loved liquor. The mountains chose moonshine because the mountains could not eat corn fast enough to survive on it, and the roads to the lowland markets were, in many counties, no more than footpaths until the Roosevelt administration paved them in the 1930s. Horace Kephart, writing in our Southern Highlanders in 1913, described entering a cove in Swain County, North Carolina, finding a still tucked beneath a laurel thicket so dense that a man could stand within 10 feet of the operation and see nothing but green. The first skill was site selection. A still was never placed beside the spring it used. It was placed downhill, never within sight of the water source, and always where the prevailing wind carried smoke away from the nearest ridge road. Maggie Bailey, who operated in Harlan County, Kentucky from the 1920s until her death in 2005 at the age of 101, was famous for choosing locations that revenue agents passed within yards of year after year without ever turning their heads. The second skill was smoke management. Hardwood fires were started before dawn when the air was still cold and heavy and the smoke hugged the ground rather than rising in a column. The fires were fed with dry hickory or seasoned oak, never green wood, never pine. By the time the sun warmed, the ridges and the air began to lift, the fire was reduced to coals, and coals do not smoke. A still operating on coals from 7 inches the morning until 2 inches the afternoon was, from the air, invisible. But sight and smoke were only the surface of it. The third skill, and the one that the Foxfire interviewers recorded with the most astonishment, was sound discipline. Copper expands as it heats. Still warming from cold to operating temperature will tick and pop, sometimes loudly and in a quiet hollow that sound carries. The old distillers wrapped the seams in wet burlap which absorbed the sharp clicks. They placed the still on a bed of river sand which absorbed vibration. They never spoke above a whisper while the still was running. Children brought to the still site were taught, before they were taught to read, that a single word at the wrong moment could put their father in federal prison. Therefore, the knowledge had to be taught, and the teaching itself became a fourth skill. Popcorn Sutton, in the self-published memoir he printed in 1,999 inches, Maggie Valley, North Carolina, described being taken to his first still at the age of 7 by his father and being told nothing. He was simply told to watch. He watched for 3 years before he was permitted to touch the equipment. By the time he was old enough to operate a still alone, he had absorbed 1,000 small judgments about temperature, color, smell, and timing that no written manual could have transferred. However, the federal government was not idle. By 1877, the Internal Revenue Service had established a permanent enforcement presence in the southern mountains. By the 1920s, with national prohibition in force, the Bureau of Prohibition had assigned hundreds of agents to the Appalachian counties. The agents were authorized to destroy stills on site to seize property without warrant, and until court rulings began to limit them in the 1930s, to fire on fleeing suspects. Between 1,922 and 1,935, according to enforcement reports filed with the Treasury Department, more than 200 moonshiners. At least 68 federal agents were killed in raids in Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Georgia. The mountain response was not violence. The mountain response was deeper craft. The fifth skill was the silent mash. Fermenting corn produces carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide produces a faint hiss as it escapes. The old distillers learned to bury their fermentation barrels in the earth, sealed with greased wooden lids, so that the gas escaped through a single small vent disguised as a rotten stump. The sixth skill was the false trail. A path leading to a still was never the only path. 3 or 4 false paths branched off, each one ending at a deadfall or a creek crossing, designed to exhaust a tracker who did not know which one to follow. The seventh skill was the relay system. Junior Johnson, who later became one of the founding figures of NASCAR, learned to drive on the runs his father organized out of Wilkes County, North Carolina. In the 1940s, the liquor never traveled in a single car for the full distance. It changed vehicles 3 or 4 times along the route, with each driver knowing only his own leg of the trip. If one driver was caught, he could betray nothing because he knew nothing. The eighth skill was the Watcher Network. Children, women, elderly men, and trusted neighbors sat on porches along every road that led into a moonshining cove. A particular sequence of laundry on a clothesline, a specific arrangement of rocking chairs, a chimney smoking at an unusual hour, each one was a signal. Willie Carter Sharp, the Virginia runner who testified in the 1935 Franklin County conspiracy trial, described a network of more than 300 informal watchers across 2 counties, none of whom were ever paid, all of whom were family or kin to family. The ninth skill was the cold drop. When a still had to be abandoned in a hurry, it was not simply walked away from. The fire was smothered with damp earth in under 30 seconds. The mash barrels were tipped and drained into a designated runoff that fed away from the spring. The copper was lifted, dismantled into 3 pieces, and hidden in 3 separate caches, none within a quarter mile of the still site. A federal agent arriving 20 minutes after a tip-off would find a clearing, ashes, and nothing else. The lesson from what these men and women did, it applies to anybody today who feels crushed by a system designed to keep them dependent. You may not live in a holler. You may live in a 3rd-floor apartment in a city where the rent rises every year and the wages do not. But the principle the mountain people live by is the same principle that can carry you through. They did not wait for permission. They did not wait for the economy to rescue them. They built parallel systems. They taught their children skills the official world refused to teach. They kept knowledge inside the family, inside the neighborhood, inside the trusted circle, and they passed it down without writing it down. If you learn one trade outside your job, one skill that produces something real with your hands, one piece of knowledge that does not depend on an employer or an app, you have begun to do what the mountain people did. You have begun to refuse dependence. That refusal is the inheritance they left behind, and it does not require a copper still to claim it. The 10th through the 17th skills were variations on concealment, transport, and counterintelligence, false bottoms and wagons, hollowed loaves of bread baked around small jars for the deliveries to widows, the sick codes embedded in church hymn requests, deliveries timed to the funeral processions that no agent would dare interrupt. The 18th was the testing of proof by sight alone, by the bead that formed when the jar was shaken, a skill precise that experienced distillers could call the alcohol content within 2% without any instrument. The 19th was the cleaning of copper with cornmeal and vinegar, a method that left no chemical residue, that produced a finished revenue agents could not distinguish from a kettle used only for apple butter. And the 20th, the one that resolves the paradox of the man who distilled for 41 years without being caught, is recorded in the trial transcript of that 1,956 case In the cross-examination on page 412, the defendant, Amos Owens of Rutherford County, not the original Cherry Bounce Man, his grandson who carried the name, was asked how he had managed to operate so long without a single eyewitness. His answer, recorded verbatim by the court reporter, was this: he had never once operated his still during daylight in clear weather. He worked only during rain, only during fog, and only during the hours when the mountains themselves were hidden. The weather was his accomplice. The agents could only see what the sky permitted them to see, and for 41 years the sky did not permit them to see him. That is the knowledge that almost died. It survived because Elliot Wigginton's Foxfire students, beginning in 1966, sat on porches with old men and old women and wrote down what they said. It survived because the Archives of Appalachia accepted the cassette tapes and the transcripts and kept them in climate-controlled storage. It survived because Joseph Earl Dabney published Mountain Spirits in 1974 and named the names that families had whispered for a century. It survived because someone refused to let it disappear. These were not criminals in the sense the federal government wished to paint them. They were people who built, in the gaps of a country that had forgotten them, a complete and functioning civilization of skill, loyalty, and refusal. If you believe real American history has been softened, sanitized, and buried, you understand why this channel exists. Of the figures named in this video, Maggie Bailey of Harlan County, Popcorn Sutton of Maggie Valley, Junior Johnson of Wilkes County, Willie Carter Sharp of Franklin County, or Amos Owens of Rutherford County, which one do you most want the full story of next? Leave the name in the comments. Tell us what state or country you are watching from. Subscribe and join the people who refuse to let this history vanish. The next video unpacks the woman the federal court called the most dangerous bootlegger in Kentucky, and the day she walked out of court a free woman after the jury deliberated for 11 minutes.